Hello guys, welcome back. In this session we will be discussing about React components. Here we will be focusing on understanding the React components, React props and React states. We have a different types of components such as stateless and stateful components. With respect, we will also be talking about class components and function components as well. React component is basically a building block of React application. Entire React.js is component based. We divide the complex UI into different React basic components. A JavaScript class or a React component that accept properties in React return the React element as well. After developing the basic React component, we can keep adding some complex UI functionalities so that we can convert our React component into the complex component as well. We can refer to other component in their input as well, and as well as the output. React controls the data flow in the component with states and props. As we discussed, it accepts the properties. It can be categorized as stateful and stateless component. We'll be discussing about in detail of stateful and stateless component. With respect, we have two further categories also, that is a functional component and class component. Generally, class component is the stateful component and functional component is a stateless component. We'll talk about the states in detail. When we create component, we require a package. As we discussed, when we create a bootstrap application using create React app package, we get three components or a packages by default installed with that, which is React, React Render and React DOM. Out of that, we have a package React. Out of that, we require the component class. When we create our own component class, that extends the component class itself, and that particular parent component class has further lifecycle hooks of React component. Out of that particular hook list, we have a very important hook method, which is the render method, that returns the entire JSX that has to be rendered when this component will be executed or rendered as a default component or a parent or a child component as well. Let's switch to Visual Studio. As of now, as we discussed, in SRC folder we have index.js, where it is decided that app component is my root component. When I go to the app component, this is the default component that has to be rendered when my application will execute or compile. I just wanted to replace this pre-written header, and I would just simply like to write down in H2 app component. When I check my output, I simply get this. Afterwards, if you wish to create your own component, it is suggested that you could create one separate folder under this SRC and name that folder as components. As I discussed, whatever you write inside the SRC will only be compiled by the compiler. So just go inside the component and add a new file, users.ts. To create your own component, custom component, you require an import statement. This has to be JavaScript. There is a package already installed at the time of creating the application using create React app. There were three packages gets installed. One is React, one is React DOM, and one is React scripts. Out of that, we require a React package under which we have a component class available, that is a root component class, which is a parent class for all the custom components. We also have direct React component to inherit a class from this package. I'll just simply create a users component and I'll extend my component class in this. You can extend your component class into your user's component by two ways. One way is you can directly write down the component that you have imported into your statement. Apart from that, if you have just imported the React, you can simply write down React.component. So you have both the options. After that, as I discussed that when we create a class component, this user is a class component that extends the component class itself. We have our various lifecycle hook methods of a particular component in React, as we have in Angular as well. And if you are from any other web programming, you also have a component lifecycle hook methods. Out of that, render is the method. Whatever you write inside this and return in the JSX format, that would be your component rendering output. We will be also talking about other lifecycle hook methods very soon. The render method gets executed and it returns the component in the JSX format as I discussed. This should be parenthesis, and just write your JSX inside this. I'll just write a div. This is, or I should write it like users list. Once this users component is created, export this class to use it into your main entry point of your component. Just write on the class name. Post that, we have app.js, which is our root component. I would just like to render the users component inside the app component. So first I'll import from ./components folder. Under that we have users.js. Do remember one thing, we do not import the component in curly braces. We just import it as a normal component. Afterwards, I would like to render this into my app component. I'll simply render this as an element. You can render by two ways. This is a container element, or you can also keep like this, a self-enclosed tag. Once I'll save this, I can see here the div is my main element, root element. Out of that we have three elements. H2 is the HTML element, users and users self-enclosed tag, both are the elements as a component. So I can see there are two users list renders here. Do not try to write down the users in lowercase. The lowercase tags are recognized from the HTML emphasis and the capital gets enclosed as a component. Post that, as I discussed, we have two types of tags. One is a class component, that is starts with a class that extends the component. This is also known as stateful component. Another we have a functional component that does not extend the class. They can be directly returned as a variable enclosed. So I'll just go to the components. I'll create a user component, user.js. Now this is the functional component. So once I'll try to create this component, I'll simply write down a variable const user. I'm using an arrow function, otherwise you can also directly write down function and then curly braces. This is a flat arrow function, a short way of writing your anonymous functions. This will return the JSX, whichever statement you would like to return. As of now, I'm writing into the div user. Once I return this user, I also need to export this component, export default user. We do not require the import statement here because we do not require the component class to be extended the functionality into the users class as well. I'll just save this. Once this functional component is successfully created, I'll just go to the app.js, and in the same component, I would also like to render the functional component, which is also known as stateless component. So first I need to import the statement where from the same folder the component comes in, component/user, and here I just would like to display the user component also as a child of this app. So first I import, and here I just render user. You can also use it by both the ways, user or self-enclosed tag as well. Once I'll save and I'll see over a browser, it is saying that in line number 4, in user.js, React must be in a scope of when using the JSX. It does not require the component to be extend into that, but if you are talking about the JSX syntax, you have used a React. Similarly, I am also using the JSX syntax in the user, so you also have a React imported in that as well. So I'll just simply import. We do not require a component class. We just require a React to use the JSX in React component. I'll just simply remove this. Save. Once you have imported the React, you can use the JSX syntaxes into your return. I'll simply say these two are my class component and these two are my functional component. This is how we create the component in React, and every component is treated as a pure JavaScript function. Somehow it is recognized as a stateless component. We do not have a lifecycle hook methods, which is a render method. But in the class component, we have further so many methods inside that. We'll be talking about that in very. So we discussed about stateful and stateless component versus class component and functional component, where class is a stateful component, where a class based on the component is considered as multiple lifecycle hook methods. Stateful React components inherits from the React.component class. All the lifecycle hook methods can be implemented in stateful component. A state that gets initialized into the constructor in a class component. The difference between stateful and stateless is where you can manage the state is the stateful. We have props and states in React, which are very important concepts. We'll be talking about in next session. And this is how we create the states. Inside the constructor, we create a state object and we associate some variables, properties in the encapsulations inside that. Later, we can customize the states and we can manage that state and set the state as per the requirements, client requirements in our component as well. Next, we have stateless component. As we discussed that in our application, we have created a functional component where we don't have the render method, and that's the reason this is known as stateless component. And the second reason is it is not inheriting the component class, so we cannot create a constructor or states inside that. That's what it is known as a stateless component. All functional based components are considered as stateless components in React. Stateless React components are pure JavaScript functions, so we don't need to have state in that. Pure JavaScript functions never require the state to be managed and changed during the entire execution. Use stateless component when data never needs to change, that remains static into the entire application. And when you have a hard code data which never to be changed in the entire application, you can create a stateless component and you can use that. Downside is that we can't have the lifecycle hooks. So further, if you have to manage the pre-rendering or rendering events, or after rendering what are the events has to be handled, that cannot be managed inside the stateless. Thank you so much guys. Stay tuned. Hello guys. In this session we will be talking about React props. Props are basically known as React properties. They are basically a kind of global objects or a variable in React component. We use props to send data to the components basically. In each and every component, as we discussed, treated as a JavaScript function, so props are passed as in parameters to that. In React, props are equivalent to the parameters of a pure JavaScript function. They allows us to pass the data from one component to another using props. Props are immutable only, which is known as read-only, because these are developed in the concept of pure functions, and in pure functions we cannot change the data of parameters. So also cannot change the data of a props in React.js as well. We use this keyword for a function-based components to access the props, and we use props as a keyword to access the props in a stateful component or a class component as well. Let's understand how to create the props. I'm already having my application in which we discussed in the last session. We have a users component which is a class component, and after that we have a user component which is a function component or a stateless component. For example, and these are being called from app.js. Let me open the users.js as well. So I'm accessing the class component and function component from the app component. Let us write a comment here. Stateful component, or also known as class component. I would like to make this statement as a comment. And the next is, I'm just printing it here, stateless component, also known as function component. So these two statements are rendering the class components. These two statements are rendering the stateless component or a function component. If you want to pass anything to your class component, you simply write or pass inside to your class component. For example, I just wanted to pass the username. So I'll just write down the name as a property and the value of this property. Let's say the user name is King Coacher, right? If you would like to access this, you can still see it is rendering the user list. This name is never to be printed anything. Because once you will render this component, what you write inside the JSX or a return, only that data will be displayed to your render method. For that purpose, if you pass any properties or a props from your root component where you are rendering your users component, you need to go to your users component, and rather than displaying the users list, you just need to display, as I discussed, this belongs to the class. As I am using the class component, we require a props keyword to be used, and after that, what's the name of the prop you are passing? Name. Afterwards, just render it back. It displays the King Coacher to you. You have displayed only one prop to one render. That's why the second users does not display anything. If I just pass the another name here, John Smith, I'll just save and check the second name is displayed here as well. This is how you pass the props to your class component. You pass the prop as a property along with the value. Afterwards, if you wanted to render this in your JSX, just write down this which belongs to the current class, whatever props are being passed to this current component while rendering this, props keyword and the name of the prop. If you have more than one props to be passed, you can simply go and pass age, and here I'm just writing 24. I'll pass the age to the another user, let's say 30. When I'll just save this, it will not render it here, because until and unless you are not going to modify or append your render, it will not display anything to you. I simply create a bar in between of two props to be printed. This dot props dot age. Save and check the render. It's 24 and 30. You can also modify with some user-defined messages. Name is this and age is this, right? This is how you pass the props to the class component. Let me just make a bar in between of that, so that we will be having a clear difference between class component and stateless component. I'll just keep it inside the paragraph, right? Now let's check how to pass the props to the function component. Let's say you are supposed to pass the prop to the function or a stateless component with the same way. Let's say name is Shreya Sharma, and you are also passing the name to the self-enclosed tag. Let's say Gautam Bhalla. Afterwards, when you just see it, nothing to be printed here with the name, because you haven't modified the JSX which is being returned from this function component. So you need to go to function component. Because you are passing the props to the function component name, you just need to go and pass the parameter props, and in the JSX access the props with this specific name. Let's say props dot name. Make sure the props names are case sensitive. So when I just print it well, it displays two names, Shreya Sharma and Gautam Bhalla. I can simply modify this name to be printed. Afterwards, we can also pass the props to the function component as in children also. For example, I just wanted to pass one more value as in children of this inside the tags, let's say 23, and this 23 is, let's say, age. So we haven't written anything anywhere that this 23 is age or something else. So how to access the values which are passed as in children of the nodes? Go and try to print this element. See, if you try to print it like this, age, and print props dot age, so in that case it is not supposed to print anything to you because we haven't written anything that this 23 is age. So in that case, you need to just simply go to your component, and rather than writing props.age, just simply write down props.children. I'll render this. I simply get 23 and 45 as well. So this is how we pass the props from class component and access using this .props.name, and how we pass the props to the class function component or a stateless function component, which is name as an attribute and 23 as in children, and access them by props.name and props.children as well. We can also make some conditional decision-making implementations in the components while passing the props. For example, you are about to create one more node for the user component. At that time, you are not passing the name, and this name is somehow called passed as in props.name directly, not children. 45 is the children actually. So when you are not passing the name and you just go and see what's the output, it's saying name is empty, something like that. I wanted to display some message instead of this empty name, so I can make some decisions to my function component. Here I am not passing the name, so I just wanted to make some decisions in my const variable. I'll say let name equals to, how we access the props, props.name or props.age. So I said if props.name is not passed, it means it is not true. If it is true, it is valid, name is being passed, then assign to the names variable props.age as it is what is being extracted. Otherwise, if name is false, means props.name is not passed, just pass the message not available, or you can simply pass unknown. So now you have make your condition into this variable name. Rather than printing this props.name, you can simply write down, I just copy this and I write it back, and I'll make this as a comment. So rather than printing the props.name, you should only write down the name. This name is a variable in which we decision that name has to be printed or an unnamed has to be printed, and this age has to be name as well. So when I see it is printing unknown, and when I pass one more note where I pass the name as well, in that case it will display you the name as per the past prop, Ankit Kumar, right? Similarly, when you are passing the children, let's say you are not passing the 45 here, and you are not in the 45 here, it means you are skipping the age for the Ankit. In that case, you are getting age as an empty. I just need to go to my component and I would like to check for the props.children as well. I'll simply write down the condition if props.children is not true. We can write down this condition in this function, but we cannot write down this into the conditional without conditional construct inside the stateful component. So I'll just write down return if props.children is true, then return this JSX. I should not write down inside the return as the conditional programming in JSX is not allowed. Write down this JSX that div is this and name is this and props is this. Right? Should write down only name. But if the props.children is not true, then return the JSX where simply print into the div invalid entry because age is not known, right? So if you are not passing the age to the Ankit, for Ankit this entry has to be invalid. So I can see that for Ankit the entry is invalid because age is not passed, children is not passed. So you can make any vice versa condition to be evaluated and to be true in your application. Similarly, if you would like to check for the class component also, that if you do not pass the name to any of the component, in that case it has to be printed invalid also. So if you are writing here user but you are not passing the name but you are passing the age, so you can go to the user component and can simply make the condition rather rendering it directly. You can simply go and check if props dot name is true, then do this, otherwise return this JSX. So I simply return this JSX here, otherwise in the else part return the JSX div invalid entry. If I go, you can see for the third class component to be rendered, the output is invalid because I am not passing any valid entry to this as well. Similarly, these props are being passed from your component where this users and user component are used or rendered as a child component. For your own component, any component, you can also have the default component as well. For example, I just wanted to write down the class name. Along with that, I would like to pass the default props where I say that the header prop is having a message, let's say header here, and I also have one more prop, footer, and I would just like to display footer here. So when this prop has to be rendered, at that point of time, it is just giving me the error because I have not placed the equals to, right? These two props are passed as in default props. So when you are printing this name, before that, if you will print one more div and display this dot props dot header, and you will also display this dot props dot footer. So whenever this component has to be rendered, these props will be taken from the default props, and this name and age prop is being passed from wherever it is being accessed. And you know that entire JSX must be placed inside the container element, root element. So I should keep that entirely into one div. So when I'll see I am having header, then I am having on passed props, then footer, then header, then footer. But for the invalid entry, I am not printing the header and footer. This is how you pass the props in the class component as well as in function component, and how to actually pass the default props inside the class component as well. I hope you really understand the concept. Thank you so much. Stay tuned. Hello guys, welcome back. In this session, we will discuss about React states. As we discussed that we have two types of components, stateful components and stateless components. The React states are to be managed in the stateful component only. In React, state is just like a data store where we store some variables and objects, and we keep changing their state as per the requirements or the actions taken in the component. React states are used to update the component when some user actions are performed, like button click or any other on-change event. State management is possible in class components only because, as I discussed, class components are stateful components and function components are stateless components. So states can be managed in React states only. The states are to be initialized into the constructor. So when the constructor gets run, constructor automatically assign the attributes state to the class or the objects to the class as well. State is just like a data store as I discussed. So whenever some events like clicking button, typing some text, pressing some keys gets occurred as in user actions, then the user actions gets update the component, so the state gets modified as well. React.component, as I discussed that stateful components are imported from the component class, is the base class for all the class-based components. So in this case, the constructor will automatically assign the attribute state to the class with some initial values. Further, we can customize or change the state's value in many cases with the help of setState method that is assigned into the class. Let's understand with the help of one example how to create that stateful element or a component with the states. We have already discussed about the props before this session. I'm having 3 components, although I'm having 4 components. 3 components and one is the entry point. Index is the entry point that renders the app component as a root component into my root element which resides in the public folder index.html. In the app component, which is the root component, it's already a component. I'm rendering a user component inside this. This user is a stateful component, that is a class component. Inside that, I'm rendering 3 custom components or a stateless component user. I'm passing name as an attribute or a prop, and I'm passing 20 as a prop children. I already discussed how to pass the props in the previous session. This name is actually a prop.name and that prop.children which is being assigned as an inside of the node as well. So in app.js, I am accessing users. In users, I am displaying 3 nested stateless users with name and age. When I'll just simply save and run this entity, in that case, I'm having name and age along with the 3 users. Afterwards, if you would like to manage some states or initialize the state management into your component, you can see that right now here we have these three names assigned as an static values. What I'll do, I'll go inside a class, I'll create a state object, I'll create a user list, an array of users in which I'm having two properties. One is name, which is Karthik Sharma, and second is age, which is 20. In this way, we have three objects in this user list under a state object: 25, 30, name is Rohit Sharma, and Himanshu Dangam. This is how we initialized the state object. Afterwards, let's say I am also having one title, users list. Now, rather than writing the static values every time, what we can do, we can simply print into this div. I'm creating h2 and I'm printing users list. Rather, I'll just write down from the state this dot state dot title that is being assigned with this user list. So when I'll just save, it is saying unexpected token because in objects the values are assigned with colon, right? But these names are right now coming from these static assigned values. You can change their values to be taken from the state. So I'll simply write down user name, which is equals to, rather than assigning the name, just write down this dot state dot user list at index 0 dot name, and keep this into your curly braces. In the same manner, I'm assigning the index 1 dot name to the second user and respectively to the third user as well. 0, 1 and 2. Similarly, you can assign the respective age based on that. Dot age, just change the index and the property name and change the index and the property name. So now these values are coming from these states, not the static values. For the time being, you can simply change one more index and can assign one more name and age or an object and can recheck that. Sarah Bowling, right? So in this way, we can initialize the state and we can use the state in our component wherever we require that. Now, we need to understand how we can change the state on the basis of user actions. So right now, I am having these 4 users with their respective name and age. Let me create a button. I'll just simply create a button. On the on-click event of this button, I would like to raise a method or call a method, do click me. When user will click over this button, it will say increase user age by 5 years. So what I'll do, I'll create a do click me method inside the component before the render method. Inside this, I just wanted to check the console.log click. I simply use here input type button and I write this as a value rather than the node. Value equals to increase the age by 5 years, right? So I'm having this button. Let me place some space before that. Once I'll open this into Chrome browser, let me just simply open this in Chrome browser. I'll just open the console window. Afterwards, when I click over this button, it simply says click 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 respectively. Now I want that the moment we will click over this button, the age of each user will increase by 5. So as of now, I am not writing any logic. I am using a set state. I just wanted to tell you how the set state works. The set state method gets called and assign your recalled or refreshed value in this state. I said keep the name same and just change the age by 5 years. 20 to 25, 25 to 30, 30 to 35 and 30 to 35. Just save this and go to your browser and check. When you click over this, you clicked once, the values are changed by 5 years. Age is being increased by 5 years. In this case, what is happening, if you remember the instance of virtual DOM, the name is not changed. Only the age is changed. So first these values are affected into the virtual DOM, which are changed, and only after the calculation changed values are replaced over a DOM. This is how set state works. When we say set state, it works with the virtual DOM, then it gets compared with the HTML DOM, and after that only the change is affected to the HTML DOM. So this is how we work with implementation of the cases where the values are changed with respect to the set state. Now the question is, if I constantly keep changing the values or age, then every time I should not write down this user list in this way. I should write down some logics. So I'll replace with some dynamic logics in this user list. Before writing the set state, when I come to this event, do click me, I'll create a new state. This dot state dot user list dot map. One by one, it works like a for each loop. Come to the each user object, and afterwards it just need to ends up here and create a const user temp, assign with the current user selected. This has to be user, and increase the user temp dot age by 5 years, and then return the user temp object into each and every component when gets called up. And in this set state, just reassign the new state to this set state. So whatever change will be placed in this, the set state will make those new state virtual changes to the virtual. So now when I go and I click, it gets every time increased by 5 years. You can simply create a decrease user age by 5 years also. The another dynamic thing that you can do in this component is, you can see every time you are writing this user list and assigning the user object and details to each component manually by at index 0, index 1, index 2. You can also rewrite this part inside the expression this dot state dot user list dot map each and every user component from this user list will iterate on the basis of index, will return the JSX, that is return user name equals to user.name. Just keep it as usr.name, and this has to be placed into the round brackets. Along with that, would like to print user.usr.age. So I can simply get the ages and I iterate the user list on the basis of that. Sometimes I get the key error that iteration should take place with the help of a key property. So in that case, you can write that I'm executing on the basis of the iteration that take place through into the map, because map works with two parameters. One is object and one is the key iteration. This is how we dynamically change the state. In the previous demonstration, we discussed how we statically change the new state with the previous state to be changed into the virtual DOM, and how the state has to be initialized as well. I hope you really understand this implementation of props and states. Thank you so much. Stay tuned.